Part 4. Invisible Enemy. Chapter 11. Deadly Silence. What happened in Pripyat stayed in Pripyat. That had been the rule before the accident, and it remained in effect for days afterward. Even though tens of thousands of people were evacuated from Pripyat and nearby villages, the Soviet government refused to tell its citizens and the world at large what had happened. Television, radio and newspapers, even local ones in Ukraine, remained silent about the accident. The Kremlin had been quite successful in keeping previous large nuclear accidents under wraps, remaining silent about radioactive pollution and the dangers it posed to Soviet citizens and the rest of the world. That was the case with an accident that took place in 1957 in the closed city of Ozersk in the Urals, better known to the Soviet leadership under the code name Chelyabinsk 40, the home of the first Soviet nuclear fuel plant producing weapons-grade plutonium. On September the 29th of that year, an underground nuclear waste tank had exploded, blasting a concrete cap weighing 160 tons from the top of the steel and concrete container and releasing 20 million curies of radioactivity into the atmosphere. The authorities had to resettle 12,000 people, mostly from the 23 villages of the region that were considered no longer fit for habitation. The houses and agricultural equipment used by the former inhabitants were buried, and an exclusion zone was established in the areas that had suffered the most. The Soviet leaders refused to release information about the Ozersk explosion, thereby endangering the lives of hundreds of thousands of their own citizens, who went on with their daily routines, not knowing how to minimize the risk caused by the accident. But although radioactive clouds never reached the borders of the USSR, it was still impossible to conceal such a massive release of radioactivity from the rest of the world. American military and civilian officials learned about the 1957 accident, but decided not to use it in a propaganda campaign against their Cold War rival. Both sides had a stake in keeping it under wraps so as not to frighten their citizens and make them reject nuclear power as a source of cheap energy. The Ozersk accident led the Soviet authorities to develop a number of strategies that would be employed at Chernobyl 30 years later. The use of military conscripts to deal with the consequences of the nuclear explosion, decontamination techniques that included burying contaminated equipment and covering contaminated areas of the nuclear plant with concrete, mass resettlement of the population, the creation of an exclusion zone, and the handling of large numbers of patients with symptoms of acute radiation poisoning. All those strategies had first been employed in Ozersk. Yefim Slavsky, the Soviet nuclear industry Tsar, and his subordinates had been in charge of dealing with the Ozersk disaster in 1957. They would be called back to deal with the Chernobyl explosion as well. Original silence about the Chernobyl accident at home and abroad also followed the Ozersk pattern. In 1986, Mikhail Gorbachev, Nikolai Ryzhkov and their subordinates in Moscow and Kiev had a model they could follow not only for dealing with the nuclear disaster, but also for speaking, or rather remaining silent, about what had happened. The tradition of complete secrecy about the nuclear program, the regime's unwillingness to admit disaster after having prided itself on being the first to build a nuclear power plant, and successfully managing the peaceful atom. Incompetence in that regard had hitherto been attributed only to the United States and the capitalist world. And finally, concern about unleashing panic and a resulting inability to mobilize the resources needed to fight the disaster. All that came together in the deafening official silence that prevailed for the first days after the explosion. But this time it proved much more difficult to restrict the flow of information. Whereas the Ozersk accident had released 20 million curies of radiation into the atmosphere, the Chernobyl disaster released 50 million curies. Besides, Chernobyl was not in the Urals, the middle of the Soviet Empire, but closer to its western edge, and the winds there spread radiation, and thus awareness of the accident, to the countries of northern and central Europe. The architects who had prepared the general plan for the construction of Pripyat in the early 1970s had pointed out that the prevailing winds there blew toward the west and northwest. That was definitely the case in the first 2 days after the accident. On the night of April the 26th, the wind blew in a northwesterly direction, carrying the radioactive plume across the Ukrainian border to Belarus, then to Lithuania, and across the Baltic Sea to Sweden, Finland, and Denmark. The first to sound the alarm were the dosimetrists at the Forsmark nuclear power plant near Uppsala, Sweden, 1,257 kilometers away from Chernobyl. Cliff Robinson, the radiation control officer at Forsmark, triggered the radiation alarm at about 7 a.m. on April the 28th, when passing from one zone of the plant to another. By midday, the Swedes had evacuated the workers at the plant and checked radiation levels at other plants, finding that they exceeded the norm everywhere. Swedish nuclear specialists soon figured out that the radiation they detected had been carried by winds blowing from the other side of the Baltic Sea. Swedish diplomats contacted 3 Soviet agencies whose activities involved nuclear power and asked for possible explanations. They got none. The Swedes were losing patience. The Minister for the Environment, Birgitta Dahl, made a statement suggesting that anyone withholding information on the release of radioactive materials was contravening international norms and agreements. This time the Soviet leaders could not conceal the facts as they had done in 1957. Their secret was out in the open, and an international scandal was in the making. The Soviet media finally broke its silence on the Chernobyl accident at 9 p.m. on Monday, April the 28th, almost 3 days after the accident, and more than 12 hours after high radioactivity levels had been detected in Sweden. In a dull voice, an announcer on the evening news program, Vremya, Time, read a brief bulletin from the Soviet news agency TASS. Its text was as follows. An accident has taken place at the Chernobyl Atomic Electricity Station. One of the atomic reactors has been damaged. Measures are being taken to eliminate the consequences of the accident. Assistance is being given to the victims. A government commission has been struck to investigate what happened. That was it. Everything was supposedly under control, and nothing was said about rising radiation levels or the evacuation of Pripyat. No Soviet newspaper published the news, either that day or the next. But even that brief announcement was no easy step for the Kremlin leadership, which was still deeply grounded in the Soviet tradition of secrecy and neglect for the immediate well-being of the people, while allegedly staying focused on the greater good and a better future. The decision to release the limited information about the accident was made only after prolonged debate in the Soviet Politburo at its first meeting after the accident. On the morning of April the 28th, a few hours after high radiation levels were detected in Sweden, Vladimir Dolgich, the Central Committee Secretary in charge of the energy sector, reported to Gorbachev and his Politburo colleagues. He stated that Unit 4 had to be buried, and that sandbags were already being dropped on the reactor. The Politburo members reluctantly accepted the conclusion that sandbagging was the only feasible measure to stop the spread of radiation. The reasons for the accident were still unknown. The working hypothesis was a hydrogen explosion, but no one knew for certain. That is guesswork for the time being, said Gorbachev. Dolgich reported that 130 people had been hospitalized, and the evacuees were being accommodated and given jobs. That was regarded as the task of the Ukrainian authorities, who were working with the refugees. There is nothing alarming as far as we are concerned. The population is calm, reported the head of the KGB, Viktor Chebrikov. But it has to be taken into account that so far the accident is known only to a small circle. Then Gorbachev asked a key question. What will we do about information? The first to respond was Dolgich. We have to finish localizing the extent of the radiation, he told the gathering. But Gorbachev was not prepared to wait. We have to make an announcement quickly. We can't delay. we have to say that there has been an explosion and that necessary measures are being taken to localize its consequences. Yegor Ligachev, who was then Gorbachev's right-hand man, but would later lead a conservative opposition to him, was the first to express approval. Gorbachev's liberal supporter, Alexander Yakovlev, added, "The sooner we make an announcement about it, the better." The others went along. Anatoly Dobrynin, the Central Committee Secretary in charge of international relations, and previously a long-time ambassador to the United States, had his own reasons for supporting Gorbachev's proposal. "The Americans will discover the fact of the explosion and the spread of the radioactive cloud in any case," he told his colleagues. Andrei Gromyko, Dobrynin's former boss, a former Soviet foreign minister, and now the holder of the largely ceremonial post of chairman of the Supreme Soviet, the Soviet Parliament, did not object to the proposal either, but he urged his colleagues to be cautious. The announcement should be formulated in such a way as to avoid arousing excessive alarm and panic, he said. A few minutes later he made another suggestion. "Perhaps we should inform our friends in particular about what has happened. After all, they buy atomic energy technology from us." This suggestion was a throwback to the old Soviet practice of parceling out information, restricting the whole truth to members of the Politburo and releasing it selectively, with different emphases, first to friends in the socialist camp, then to enemies in the West, and last of all to their own people. But Gorbachev wanted none of that. "We have to inform our own public first," he told Gromyko. When the Politburo members considered in the late morning of April the 28th whether or not to make the accident public, they believed that the nuclear contamination was limited to the territory of the Soviet Union, and that it was entirely a Soviet matter. Dolgich asserted that the radioactive stain was only 60 kilometers in diameter. Prime Minister Nikolai Ryzhkov remarked that radioactivity had reached Vilnius in the Baltics, and the chief of the Soviet General Staff, Marshal Akhromeyev, estimated the diameter of the radioactive cloud at 600 kilometers. Unbeknownst to the members of the Politburo, contaminated clouds had already crossed Soviet borders and were beginning to create havoc abroad. By the time the Soviet television anchor read the terse announcement late in the evening of April the 28th, the international scandal was already brewing. The Soviet authorities were now barely admitting something already known to Western governments, and through word of mouth, to large numbers of Soviet citizens. Gorbachev later defended his record, maintaining that he and the Politburo simply did not have all the requisite information at the time. "I absolutely reject the accusations that the Soviet leadership intentionally held back the truth about Chernobyl," he wrote in his memoirs. "We simply did not know the whole truth yet." In fact, they knew much more than they admitted. Even those prepared to break with the Soviet tradition of secrecy, such as Gorbachev and Ryzhkov, were afraid of losing control over the situation. "And what should I have told the country?" mused Ryzhkov later. "People, a reactor has exploded. The radiation is off the scale. Save yourselves as best you can." On April the 29th, the day after the Soviet announcement, a Pan-American flight carrying the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union landed in Moscow, and a Soviet Aeroflot flight made a landing at Dulles International Airport in Washington, D.C. In both cases, it was a special occasion. Direct flights between the two countries had been cancelled in December 1981 at the initiative of the Reagan administration to protest the imposition of martial law in Poland. Now they were finally being resumed as a result of the first meeting between President Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev in Geneva in December 1985. There the two leaders had sized each other up and decided, despite major ideological and philosophical differences, that they could work together. The Soviet delegation on the Aeroflot flight was led by the Deputy Minister of Civil Aviation, who made a statement to American journalists expressing his hope that the resumption of direct flights would promote increased cooperation between the two countries. He was ready to discuss the future, but the reporters seemed more interested in Chernobyl, asking him about the scope of the catastrophe and the number of victims. The high official was at a loss. He knew less about the accident than the journalists asking the questions did. On the same day, the American public received its first substantial information on what was going on in and around Chernobyl. The severity of the accident, which spread discernible radioactive material over Scandinavia, was not immediately clear, wrote Serge Schmemann, the Associated Press reporter in Moscow, in the New York Times. He continued, but the terse statement distributed by the TASS news agency and read on the evening television news suggested a major accident. The phrasing also suggested that the problem had not been brought under full control at the nuclear plant. Schmemann reported on the deep concern in Scandinavia about the rising levels of radiation, noting that the Soviet announcement had come hours after Sweden, Finland and Denmark reported abnormally high radioactivity levels in their skies. Ronald Reagan was first informed about the Chernobyl accident by his foreign policy and national security team on the same day, April the 29th. He was on board Air Force One, travelling from Guam to Bali to attend a South Asian summit. The administration immediately set up a task force to monitor the accident and its possible impact on the United States. It was overseen by Vice President George H.W. Bush and headed by Lee Thomas, the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. The first intelligence memo on Chernobyl prepared by the CIA is also dated April the 29th. The CIA experts called the Chernobyl accident the worst nuclear disaster in world history and reported on rumors suggesting that hundreds, if not thousands, of people were dying of the explosion. They also admitted an intelligence failure, their inability to gather any information on the disaster prior to the Swedish detection of high radiation levels and the Soviet announcement of the accident. We are disturbed by the lack of intelligence evidence prior to the Swedish disclosures and the near-simultaneous official Soviet announcement that this disaster was unfolding over some 3 days. We are especially disturbed because it occurred right in the heart of NATO's warning of war domain. We need to find out why, read the CIA report. On the basis of satellite surveillance data, the authors of the CIA report speculated that the graphite in the reactor destroyed by the original blast was still burning and releasing additional radioactivity into the atmosphere. CIA experts predicted the disruption of large areas downwind of the radiation source due to evacuations, shutdown of plants and facilities, and decontamination activities. They also foresaw the impact of radiation on agriculture, especially the dairy industry, and the pollution of water supplies, especially downstream on the Dnieper toward Kiev. The CIA made the safe bet that the Soviets' withholding of information about the accident would hurt them in the international arena. Governments and publics in both East and West Europe could be alienated in lasting ways by Soviet failure to provide an early warning when something like 3 days were available. This will noticeably dull Soviet persuasiveness on all manner of negotiations, from arms control to trade and their related propaganda efforts. The Reagan administration's first public reaction to the news from Chernobyl was an offer of assistance. It was presented to a Soviet diplomat who came to the State Department to discuss nuclear arms control on April the 29th. He was asked for additional information, but had none to offer. It was then that the State Department voiced its first criticism of the Soviets for not being forthcoming with details about the accident. The delay in saying anything about the disaster, the fragmentary information that has been issued, all are typical of the Soviets, a State Department official told the press. Expectations that the Soviet Union would actually accept U.S. help were quite low, especially if, as was wrongly suspected, the Chernobyl nuclear plant was part of a military-run program. On the next day, April the 30th, Soviet diplomats delivered a message from Mikhail Gorbachev to Ronald Reagan. The message confirmed that the accident had taken place. They say that a leak of radioactive material has required the partial evacuation of the populations in regions immediately adjacent to the accident, the White House Deputy Press Secretary, Larry Speakes, told the media. They indicate that the radiation situation has been stabilized, and finally, they note that the dissemination of radioactive contamination in the western, northern, and southern sections has been detected. The message further states that these levels of contamination are somewhat above permissible norms, but are not in the extent which would require special measures to protect the population. Speakes said that the US government was pushing the Soviets for more information. Reliable information on what the US intelligence community and media called the world's largest nuclear disaster was soon substituted with rumors. On April the 29th, Luther Whittington, a correspondent for United Press International in Moscow, reported that 80 people had died on the spot as a result of the explosion, and that 2,000 more were on the way to hospital. He cited a telephone interview with an unnamed source in Kiev. The same source allegedly claimed that between 10,000 and 15,000 people had been evacuated from Pripyat. In reality, the former numbers were gross overestimates, while the latter were significantly below the actual numbers of people evacuated from Pripyat and its environs. Nonetheless, many Western newspapers picked up and disseminated the United Press International report. The Chicago Stock Exchange lost no time in betting on mass contamination of Soviet crops and a dramatic increase in American agricultural exports to replace potential losses, not only in the USSR, but also in the countries of Northern and Eastern Europe affected by the disaster and the radioactive fallout. The Soviets were furious. Vladimir Fronin, a Soviet reporter who accompanied the Soviet delegation that landed at Dulles on April the 29th, was upset but also probably frightened when he began to watch coverage of the Chernobyl disaster by the leading American television networks. Fronin concluded that the accident was being used to undermine emerging Soviet-US cooperation. In the report that he later published in the Soviet media, Fronin ridiculed claims that the Soviet authorities were hiding the truth from their own citizens. He compared what he called the hostile attitude of the American media towards the USSR with the Soviet reaction to the death of 7 American astronauts as a result of the space shuttle explosion in January 1986. "If we remember the Challenger," wrote Fronin, "when there was nothing but sympathy for the Americans both in our press and in our hearts, then the soul grows bitter." Fronin and the regime he represented were clearly on the defensive. Fronin forgot to mention the American offer of assistance. All but silent about Chernobyl, the Soviet propaganda chiefs flooded their media with information about nuclear disasters abroad. The terse Soviet announcement of the Chernobyl accident, wrote Serge Schmemann in the New York Times, was followed by a TASS dispatch noting that there had been many mishaps in the United States, ranging from 3 Mile Island outside Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, to the Guinea plant near Rochester, New York. TASS said an American anti-nuclear group registered 2,300 accidents, breakdowns, and other faults in 1979. On April the 30th, the Soviet Union's leading newspaper, Pravda, or Truth, finally broke the printed media silence on the accident by publishing a short announcement at the very bottom of the second of its 6 pages. It restated the information released by TASS on April the 28th and added some new details. The name of Boris Shcherbina as head of the government commission was mentioned. The evacuation of the city of Pripyat was acknowledged, although it was called not a city but a settlement, and the public was assured that radiation levels were being closely monitored. As Mikhail Gorbachev, Nikolai Ryzhkov and their Politburo colleagues released limited information on the disaster, their main challenge was to balance the desire to maintain a degree of credibility as responsible world citizens with concern about losing control on the ground and creating panic in the areas most affected by the disaster. The Ukrainian KGB reported to the party bosses in Kiev on April the 28th about growing concern among the population of the areas close to the nuclear plant regarding the spread, as they believe, of radiation. The situation was becoming especially tense in Kiev, only 130 kilometers away from the damaged reactor. The mobilization of buses, nuclear specialists, and police to deal with the consequences of the disaster caused rumors to spread among the worried inhabitants of Ukraine's capital. So did the arrival of patients with radiation sickness in Kiev hospitals. And yet the government was saying nothing about the scope of the catastrophe or the need for citizens to protect themselves. The whole city is alarmed, and they say that the hospitals are overcrowded, noted Ukraine's leading writer, Oles Honchar, in his diary. But there is not a word of information on the radio, just upbeat music and cheerful songs. On April the 30th, the Ukrainian Politburo met to discuss the situation. The main issue on the agenda was the May the 1st parade, scheduled to take place in downtown Kiev the following day. May the 1st was one of the two most important events on the political calendar of the Soviet Union, the other being November the 7th, the day of the Bolshevik takeover in 1917. May the 1st, officially known as the Day of International Worker Solidarity, traced its origins to the events on Haymarket Square in Chicago on May the 1st, 1886, when the police had opened fire on striking workers. It was a living reminder of the international origins and ambitions of Russian communism. On May the 1st, the Soviet authorities always organized mass demonstrations. Many Soviet citizens regarded them in a non-political way as a spring holiday, an opportunity to get together with friends and co-workers and take part in the only form of public gathering allowed by the regime. On April the 29th, the day before the Ukrainian Politburo meeting, the head of the Ukrainian KGB, Stepan Mucha, sent a memo to the party boss of Ukraine, Volodymyr Chicherbitsky, summarizing the work of the secret police in preparation for the all-important public holiday. The main concerns were about any possible manifestations of disloyalty toward the regime, especially the dissemination of leaflets critical of the government. Starting on April the 21st, reported Mucha, KGB officers had met more frequently with their informers. Surveillance was increased on 4 Western diplomats stationed in or visiting Kiev, 6,060 foreign students, of whom 38 were suspected of espionage, and 22 of belonging to radical Muslim organizations. Among the Soviet citizens who received special attention before the holidays were 89 individuals suspected of espionage, 54 labeled as Ukrainian nationalists, 24 Zionists, 17 religious dissenters, mostly Protestants, 6 Crimean Tatar activists, and 223 mentally ill individuals. The KGB was also investigating the Chernobyl accident as a possible act of sabotage and increasing its surveillance over the rest of the nuclear power plants and areas adjacent to Chernobyl, where the main concern was the spread of alarmist rumors and tendentious information. On the political front, everything seemed to be under control, but that was not all. There was also the spread of radiation, against which the KGB was powerless. The main question before the Ukrainian leadership was whether to even hold the parade, as the winds had changed direction and the radiation front was approaching Kiev. On April the 28th, the KGB reported that radiation levels in the city were within the norm, or less than 20 microrontgens per hour, but by the next day they had already increased to 100 microrontgens. Ukrainian leaders were confused as they could not properly understand the significance of the radioactivity data. Chicherbitsky kept writing on KGB reports about the radiation level. What does this mean? The party leaders in Moscow believed that it did not mean much, or rather that the radiation levels were basically within the norm. Valentina Shevchenko, the head of the Ukrainian parliament, remembered that before the Politburo meeting the Ukrainian leaders received instructions from Moscow to go ahead with the rally. The May Day parade in Kiev had to send a signal to the world that things were normal, that people were safe and felt secure, and the Western media was engaging in a propaganda war by spreading false news about huge destruction caused by the explosion and about thousands of victims. television images and newspaper photos of happy Kievans marching in the center of their city were supposed to send a message to both domestic and foreign audiences that everything was fine and that the party was in control. After some deliberation and consultations with experts, the Ukrainian leaders decided to proceed with the rally, but to reduce the time allotted for the parade and the number of participants. Traditionally, each of Kiev's 10 districts sent between 4,000 and 4,500 participants to the rally. This time the quota was set at 2,000, and those called upon to march in the parade were to be younger people. Szczyrbicki also warned Politburo members and city leaders to participate with members of their families, including children and grandchildren, to show the citizens of Kiev that the situation was safe. On the morning of May the 1st, Pravda carried its usual front-page slogan, "Long live May the 1st, the day of international worker solidarity. Proletarians of all countries, unite." Buried at the very bottom of the second page was the official update on the situation in and around Chernobyl. The statement said that it was improving. It also attacked those in the West who were allegedly trying to arouse panic in the Soviet Union. Some Western agencies are spreading rumors to the effect that thousands of people died in the accident at the atomic energy station. As already reported, 2 people actually died, and 197 were hospitalized in all, of whom 49 left the hospital after observation. The work of enterprises, state farms, and institutions is proceeding normally, wrote Pravda. Technically, Pravda's figures were correct. The firefighters and plant operators most affected by the explosion and release of radioactivity were still hanging on to what remained of their lives at the hospitals in Moscow and Kiev, and the medium and long-term consequences of the disaster were yet to be determined. The regime had clearly decided to take a more proactive stance in the information battle over the disaster, without releasing much more information. On May the 1st, the operations group of the Politburo, led by Premier Ryzhkov, adopted a resolution to send a group of Soviet correspondents to areas adjacent to the zone of the Chernobyl atomic energy station in order to prepare material for the press and television, attesting to normal everyday activity in those areas. Meanwhile, radiation levels in Kiev had become more dangerous. According to data collected by experts of the Ukrainian Institute for Nuclear Research, gamma radiation had begun to climb rapidly in the Ukrainian capital on the morning of April the 30th. By noon, it had reached 1,700 microrontgens per hour, but the levels then subsided. By the time the Ukrainian Politburo meeting ended at 6 p.m., the gamma levels had dropped to 500 microrontgens per hour. It was a promising sign. The levels held steady throughout the night, but a rapid new increase was registered at 8 a.m. on May the 1st, just as people started to gather for the rally in downtown Kiev. It was a disaster in the making. The increase in radiation levels was especially rapid on Kiev's main street, Khreshchatyk, the site of the May Day parade. It was located on lower ground between 2 of the city's hills. The threat to all participants in the rally was very serious, recalled the city's mayor, Valentin Zgursky. Radioactive currents in the air went directly to Khreshchatyk from the Dnieper side. Sometime after 9 a.m., Politburo members and city fathers gathered near the monument to Vladimir Lenin on the city's main square in the middle of Khreshchatyk. They were waiting for the leader of the Republic's party, Volodymyr Szczyrbicki, to arrive for the opening of the rally. Only he had the right to begin the ceremony, according to the event's unwritten protocol. By that time, radiation levels had reached 2,500 microrontgens per hour, the highest level that would be recorded that day. But Szczyrbicki was nowhere in sight. Then, just before 10 a.m., those gathered near the Lenin monument saw Szczyrbicki's car speeding towards the square. The limousine stopped near the stage constructed for the parade. Szczyrbicki emerged from the car swearing angrily. Zgursky heard him say, "I told him that the parade could not be held on Khreshchatyk. It's not Red Square, but a valley. Radiation concentrates here. and he said to me, "Just try not holding the parade. I'll leave you to rot." According to the version of events given later by Shcherbitsky's wife, Rada, Gorbachev had threatened to expel her husband from the party. "If you don't hold the demonstration, you can say goodbye to the party." Speaking to his comrades, Shcherbitsky never called his recent interlocutor by name, but few doubted that he was talking about Gorbachev. "To hell with him. Let's go and start the parade," he said. They all climbed the stairs to the podium, and Shcherbitsky took his place in the center of the leadership line, with Valentina Shevchenko, the head of the Ukrainian parliament, to his left, and Oleksandr Lyashko, the head of the Republic's government, to his right. "Everyone was bareheaded," recalled Lyashko. "My grandchildren were in the column of marchers. My wife was on the guest platform along with the wives of the other leaders. After all, none of us was fully informed at the time. On the contrary, people were trying to minimize the danger. No one was trying harder than the political and industry bosses in faraway Moscow. I got a call from Slavsky, the all-union minister of medium machine building, whose department dealt with atomic energy," recalled Lyashko. "Why are you raising such a fuss? I'll come and shut down your reactor with my ass alone." The photos taken that day in downtown Kiev show Shcherbitsky, Lyashko, Shevchenko, and other Ukrainian leaders waving to the crowds of Kievans marching on Khreshchatyk, just as the level of radioactivity in the city reached its peak. Unlike those on the podium, the marchers knew nothing about the danger. The photos show members of folk ensembles dressed in traditional Ukrainian costumes, and young people carrying portraits of Marx, Engels, and Lenin, as well as photos of Politburo members, starting with Mikhail Gorbachev. The marchers are lightly dressed. It is a warm, sunny morning. Many came with small children. Some fathers are seen bearing them on their shoulders. Children were also marching in their own formations. Our future successors, a large group of children, brought up the rear of the column, remembered one of the participants. They were catching up with us, laughing and dancing. One of the marchers, Natalia Petrovna, describing the event later, said that at first everything seemed the same as in previous rallies, but when she and her fellow marchers entered the main square and she looked at the podium, normally occupied by representatives of various branches of the Soviet economy, top managers and shock workers, that is, workers who had been honored for their exemplary discipline and productivity, she could not believe her eyes. It was half empty. I asked in wonder, "Where are the energy people?" she recalled, referring to employees of the nuclear energy sector, whom she knew from previous parades. She was then approached by a man in plain clothes, whose behavior suggested that he was from the KGB. Natalia Petrovna remembered that the man whispered, "Go away, go away." He took me by the arm and led me after the departing column of marchers. The KGB did not want anybody disrupting the orderly procession of people in front of the government tribune, and was not going to tolerate questions that could cause panic in the city. After the rally ended, Natalia Petrovna recalled, "I sat down on a bench to rest. I felt weak and dizzy. My throat was dry with a strong tickle. Those were clear signs of exposure to radiation, but Natalia Petrovna suffered no long-term consequences." Another woman, Natalia Morozova, who came to Kiev from Odessa for the May Day holidays, was not so lucky. "Damn them all," she wrote later to the special commission appointed by the Ukrainian parliament to investigate the handling of the Chernobyl accident. Her curse was addressed to the Ukrainian leaders who greeted people from the podium. "I was pregnant and went to Kiev on April the 24th to visit a female relative. I went to the rally and did some boating on the Dnieper. I managed to leave Kiev only on May the 12th, and in July, my child was stillborn." On May the 1st, Ukraine's leading writer, Oles Honchar, noted in his diary, "A parade on Khreshchatyk, people cheerfully shouting slogans, everyone pretending as if nothing had happened. The Soviet leaders in the Kremlin may have prevented panic, but the unintended consequence of the radioactive parade was the loss of legitimacy of the regime it was supposed to enhance. My government deceived and betrayed me. When the Chernobyl disaster took place, I learned of it not from my government but from a foreign one abroad, wrote the Kievan worker Georgy Ral to the Ukrainian Parliamentary Commission. Indeed, the Western media, alerted to the danger by rising radiation levels in Sweden, had been the first to break the news, and Russian and Ukrainian language broadcasts on Voice of America and Radio Liberty had taken the lead in advising Soviet citizens about precautionary measures against radiation, but the Soviets had jammed the broadcasts. Meanwhile, KGB agents were busy confiscating leaflets that, in their opinion, contained tendentious fabrications about the consequences of the accident at the Chernobyl Atomic Energy Station. Mikhail Gorbachev never took responsibility for what happened in Kiev that day, but he did later admit that holding the parade was a mistake. Rallies were not cancelled because on May the 1st there was as yet no full picture of what had happened, he said in an interview given in 2006, 20 years after the disaster. Indeed, we were afraid of panic. You yourself can imagine the possible consequences of mass panic in a city of many millions. It's clear today that that was a mistake.